want to start with this
Good morning.
new after action assessment, basically, that we're seeing from all of these people that I know you know very well as well. They say that they believe the U.S. had a more disappointing pandemic response than other countries. Would you agree with that characterization?
Yeah, there were a lot of problems, Caitlin, that we had. We had a fractionated response. And, as Mike Osterholm just mentioned, there was a lot of politicization. We thought we were the best prepared country in some respects from a scientific standpoint, as manifested by the really overwhelming success of the rapid development of the vaccine. Then we did very well. But when it came to the implementation of public health, the uniformity of a response, the communication, the ability to get data in real time, we really fell very short. So hopefully the lessons learned from that type of a really strict analysis of what went wrong will help prepare us for future pandemics. But no doubt about it, there were a lot of things that we didn't do as well as we could, and we've got to do better, not only in the continued response to the current outbreak, but in preparation for the inevitability of future outbreaks.
Yeah, and that's why this is so important, to look back at what happened, not just to criticize people, but to learn, to see what can be changed going forward. You know, the public health emergency is actually ending in about 2 weeks. Do you think it's the right time for that to end?
You know, there's obviously debate about that, but I think in general, we really need to move forward so long as we don't leave a big gap in being able to take care of the people who may not have available to them now the things that were very, very important to them at the time that we had all of the issues that were related to the emergency. We want to be able to have some sort of a safety net for them to be able to get drugs and to be able to get vaccines, so those things don't fall between the cracks. If we take care of that, I think that it's important to move forward. I mean, everybody wants this outbreak behind us. We want to make sure we don't just forget about it completely, because we still have about 150 deaths per day, and there's still a lot of virus out there. So we can't just completely forget about it. We got to continue to pay attention to it.
Yeah, a lot of questions about what the effects of that ending would look like. I want to get into this New York, this New York Times interview that you did, really just basically looking back at not just how you handled it, how the U.S. handled it overall. You talked about being perceived as kind of the personification of restrictions. And you had this quote that stood out to me. You said, "Show me a school that I shut down. Show me a factory that I shut down. Never. I never did. I gave a public health recommendation that echoed the CDC's recommendation, and people made a decision based on that." Now, I don't have to tell you that people who have criticized your response have seized on that comment in particular to say, yeah, you weren't directly responsible for Prattville Elementary School closing or whatnot, but because of the recommendations that came from you and other top public health officials, those are decisions that you saw school administrators make, governors make, and you understand the influence that your recommendations had on decisions like that, right?
Well, that's true, Caitlin. But the point that I made in my response to the reporter in the New York Times article was that what it is that there was a personification of me as a person who essentially closed everything down. Those were public health recommendations that came from the CDC, and I have always been very supportive of the CDC because they base their recommendations purely on public health issues. And the point that I made, that as public health officials, it's our responsibility to give the public health perspective to it. The decision of how that balances with other considerations really comes from other authorities, from authorities who have things other than just the public health to be concerned about, economic and other considerations. So that's the point I was making. I was not trying to shun away from responsibility. We made a public health recommendation based on sound public health principles. But that's not the only issue that you need to consider when you're in the middle of an outbreak.
Well,
you have
right.
to consider a number of other things, and that's the point we were making.
I think a lot of parents and teachers would say, well, yeah, the CDC, when they made these recommendations, they should have considered the effects that learning loss would have on children when they're making a decision like that. Is that something you agree with?
No, I do. I believe that you have to consider a variety of other things. But remember, at the time that the shutdown occurred, I mean, you have to distinguish, Caitlin, between the crisis at the point when our hospitals were being overrun and we were having cooler trucks to put bodies in because we didn't have enough room in a morgue, that's when things shut down. The real issue is, how long do you keep that shut down? How long do you keep the schools closed? And if you recall and go back on many of the things I've said in a lot of interviews, is that we've got to do whatever we can to get the schools open and get them open safe and keep them open. And I've said that many, many times. But the initial decision early on in the middle of that crisis, I believe, was the right decision. How long you kept them closed really varied depending upon the locale.
In addition to schools, masking was probably one of the most divisive parts of COVID. I think whether or not people wore one, whether they had to wear one. A really striking comment that you made in this interview, you said, from a broad public health standpoint, and I'm quoting you now, at the population level, masks work at the margins, maybe 10%. You once said a national mask mandate could work. That comment saying, they work at the margins, maybe 10%, I think would raise a lot of eyebrows, given so many people had to wear a mask, whether they were on a plane, whether they were in certain public facilities. To hear that they only work at the margins, maybe 10%, would make a lot of people ask, okay, then why was I wearing a mask for so many times?
Caitlin, we got to be careful, because if you read very carefully what I said, if you look at the broad public health effect, when you have masks that are so-called mandated or supposed to be worn, because so many people don't wear them, even though they're in an arena in which masks are supposed to be worn, or they don't wear them properly from a public health standpoint on the cohort of people, the effect can be only marginal. And as we mentioned, it was 10, 13% or so. But for the individual who religiously wears a properly fitted mask, the effect is much, much, much better than that. It's 85, 90% or more. So we were trying to distinguish between what the broad effect on a population is when you have mask wearing versus the effect on the individual who religiously and properly wears the mask. There's a big difference there. That's what we were referring to about on the margins versus an individual effect of a person.
Yeah, there is a big difference, of course, in like someone like a doctor, someone who's used to doing this. In hindsight, though, when you look at this, do you think the mask mandates were a mistake?
Caitlin, I don't want to say a mistake, but I think we really need to remember next time we're confronted with this, that when you have a situation where there's doubt in the minds of some people about whether something works or not, we better try to reach out and be a better explainer of why we feel these things are important. Because whenever, particularly in our country with our free spirit, which we all embrace, that people being told what to do very often has the opposite effect. That's what I was referring to in that interview.
Yeah, I know you said a similar thing about vaccine requirements as well. One last question, something else that was at the end of your interview, you referenced the work that you did with HIV and with AIDS and the outreach that you felt changed how that response was, your outreach to that community specifically. And you said, I've always felt when people are pushing back at you, even though in many respects are often left field somewhere, there always appears to be a kernel of truth, maybe a small kernel or a big segment of truth in what they say. One of the things that we really need to do is we need to reach out now and find out exactly what it was that made them push back, referencing people who did have problems wearing a mask with vaccine requirements. Who do you think should be doing that outreach before there is another pandemic, if it's inevitable, as you say?
Caitlin, I think we all should be doing it. I believe public health officials should be doing it. People who are political leaders should be doing it. The point I was making at the end, I felt very, very sincerely. There was a lot of, opposition of do this, don't do this, people pushing back. Those people could not all be wrong. We've got to understand what the underlying reason why they were pushing back about what looked like completely valid public health principles. There's something wrong with that. We were not doing something completely correctly, because we can't have those many people who are fundamentally good people, yet they're pushing back on things that are life-saving. We got to figure that out, and we got to reach out to those people and not make them the opposition. That's the point I was making.
Yeah. All right. It's good to look back at all of this, obviously, because the questions about what happens when there is another pandemic. Dr. Fauci, thank you for your time this morning.